Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good to see you all here, and welcome to anybody watching remotely. The lectures I'm going to do this week are really going to take us step by step through the writings and career of F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm essentially following the chronology of his life, though taking liberty to leap all over the place as the whim strikes me. Today I want to essentially start with his boyhood and early years in St. Paul, Minnesota, take him through the Princeton years, his meeting with Zelda, the publication of his astonishing first novel, This Side of Paradise, some of his writings of the early 20s, and get us all the way up to the publication of The Great Gatsby in 1925. After I've used my 5 hours, I'll turn it over to somebody else to have their remarks on Fitzgerald. So we're going to cover a lot today, but that's appropriate. I know you guys are ready to go. And I want to start with this concept, this idea. F. Scott Fitzgerald hungered for success. From his earliest years, he hungered for success. His most youthful desires were for triumph and fame and glory. To the very end of his life, he battled against insomnia by immersing himself in bedtime fantasies of glory on either the football field or the battlefield. And certainly for a time, at least until his first novel, maybe even beyond, he cared less for being a great writer and more for being a great something. Greatness was what he hungered for. The writing of The Great Gatsby changed all of that. Once he had attained that level of achievement in writing, he was committed to the ideal of being the great American novelist of his generation. So the writing of Gatsby channeled his desire for greatness into a determination to be a great American writer. But Fitzgerald had a curious relation to success. And I've given you this quote on the outline and on the first slide here where he said, in 1937, looking back on his career, and he always is a backward-looking writer, he wrote, "The compensation of a very early success is a conviction that life is a romantic matter." So what does it mean to believe that life is a romantic matter? For Fitzgerald, this meant the conviction that a triumph beyond words was possible. The perfect love, the perfect work of art, the perfect life. Fitzgerald's favorite poet beyond compare was the young romantic poet John Keats. And Keats's work did Fitzgerald as much harm as good in a certain way. The Keatsian ideal, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that is all ye need to know on earth, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. It's a transcendent ideal. It is otherworldly, unearthly, immortal, and unchanging. And that transcendent yearning informs everything F. Scott Fitzgerald ever wrote, and it informs the way he led his life. And this is a childish yearning. Only a child believes that life can be free of pain, completely fulfilling, perfect in every way. Part of the coming-of-age experience is learning this and learning how to live with it. Learning to glory and exult in our very imperfection and seeing therein our specifically human greatness. Now, F. Scott Fitzgerald was no child. He was too intelligent, too insightful, too careful a student of life, and too acutely aware of the suffering and frustrations of human life not to understand life's reality. Yet at the same time, he was too enchanted with the romantic dream of transcendence to be willing to let it go. This is what I talked about last night as his capacity for infinite hope and at the very same moment, infinite regret. So Fitzgerald embraced a worldview that guaranteed his failure. He refused to surrender the dream, and he knew the dream was impossible. Hence, the only outcome would be failure to attain the dream. For F. Scott Fitzgerald, in life as in art, the aesthetic of failure became his defining mode. And I'll return to this idea of an ascetic of failure throughout my remarks this week. Now, the first myth to dismiss with F. Scott Fitzgerald is that he was born into the bosom of the fabulously rich. Quite the contrary. Like Nick Carraway, Fitzgerald's life begins in classic middlebrow American fashion. His maternal grandparents were Irish immigrants from County Fermanagh who set up as grocery wholesalers in the 1870s and managed to slowly rise into the middle class. His father's family were Scottish immigrants who settled in Maryland, and he had some sense of Southern aristocracy, though little wealth. His own parents had a strong, though largely negative effect on Fitzgerald. His mother spoiled him with attention and praise, contributing to his sense that he had a great destiny to fulfill. His father moved from one job to another, which meant the family moved from one house to another, and there was always a nascent sense of homelessness or rootlessness for Fitzgerald. Very importantly, he comes from St. Paul, Minnesota, what Nick will famously call my Middle West. He would grow up just a long stone's throw from Mark Twain's Hannibal, Missouri. The Mississippi would course right through his hometown. He comes from the West. Like Hemingway, like Sherwood Anderson, like so many writers of the early 1900s, not from that rarefied New England air of the 19th century, but a sort of new stock of writers coming from the West. Fitzgerald had a troubled relationship with his father. He would come to see his father as in many ways a failure, and the failed father would haunt his fiction. And he kills off the father in almost each one of his books, long before his own father actually died in 1931. In 1908, when Scott was 12, his father lost his best job at Procter & Gamble, an event that Fitzgerald later described as the breaking of his father. He wrote, "That morning he had gone out a comparatively young man, a man full of strength, full of confidence. He came home that evening an old man, a completely broken man. He had lost his essential drive, his immaculateness of purpose. He was a failure the rest of his days." Immaculateness of purpose. That's the Gatsby drive. That's the Fitzgerald drive. That's what you saw his father as losing, and saw himself as in a sort of desperate attempt to be true to or to realize that drive. So the young Fitzgerald received from his parents the idea that he was special, blessed, reserved for a great life, and at the same time a vision of failure and loss, a sense of how easily a man could be broken. And the tension between these two would drive Fitzgerald throughout his life. I'll be depending a lot during this week on the work of Matthew Brucoli, who by his own admission is the Fitzgerald scholar. And it's largely true. Brucoli, who recently passed away, remarkable scholar. I continue to think his biography of Fitzgerald remains the best. But here's how he closes the chapter on Fitzgerald's life up to age 15. He says, "By the time he was 15, Scott was accustomed to hearing the drums of destiny beating for him. He knew that he was different from his friends, that he had larger, if inchoate, ambitions, and that some rare fate was reserved for him. As he wrote of his autobiographical hero, Amory Blaine, in This Side of Paradise, and then this is a famous passage from that novel, always after he was in bed, there were voices, indefinite, fading, and chanting just outside his window. And before he fell asleep, he would dream one of his favorite waking dreams, the one about becoming a great half-pack, or the one about the Japanese invasion, when he was rewarded by being made the youngest general in the world. It was always the becoming he dreamed of, never the being." That's Fitzgerald about Amory Blaine, and it shows the inside of Fitzgerald about F. Scott Fitzgerald. The becoming, not the being. Fitzgerald had a fine sort of middle school education. He went to the Newman School in New Jersey, starting in 1911. There he experienced the camaraderie of other highly intelligent students. He experienced the thrill of New York, particularly the Broadway stage. He was always attracted to the drama. He experienced the allure of nearby Princeton, just down the road from Hackensack. And he experienced for the first time the effects of alcohol, probably taking his first drink in 1913. And these sort of arenas, the Princeton experience, the lure of the big city, the lure of the bottle, these would define some of the major points of Fitzgerald's life. There he also met Father Cyril Sigourney Webster Fay. He met him at the Newman School, this highly influential Catholic priest on Fitzgerald's life who gave him the example of the intellectual, spiritual guide and who was a substitute father figure in many ways for Fitzgerald. And Fitzgerald was always seeking substitute father figures, always searching for that figure in his own life. Now, there were only 3 schools for the gifted and wealthy sons of America in 1914, no offense to Dartmouth: Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And Fitzgerald wanted only Princeton. I don't know why he said at the time, but I think of all Harvard men as sissies, like I used to be, and all Yale men as wearing big blue sweaters and smoking pipes. I think of Princeton as being lazy and good-looking and aristocratic, like a spring day. So I did my graduate work at Princeton, and though I share his affection for it, the Princeton I knew bears no resemblance to the school that he is describing. But it was another time. Fitzgerald always considered himself an honorary Southerner through his father's Maryland family. And Princeton, of course, is the Southerners' Ivy League school, what Fitzgerald would describe as, quote, the pleasantest country club in America. But Fitzgerald barely made the admission standard. His entrance exams were so mediocre that it required personal interviews and makeup exams to get in. And to say he was an unimpressive student is to praise him beyond his merits. He was basically uninterested in the work required to excel academically. And this would prove to be a problem at Princeton. His Princeton experiences were seminal for Fitzgerald. In many ways, they determined his later life. He came to Princeton filled with aspirations for greatness, particularly in athletic, social, and literary arenas. And in all those areas, we could say he stumbled or even that he failed. He encountered a social structure there more dense and complex than anything his St. Paul upbringing had prepared him for. What he described in this side of paradise as that breathless social system. He moved among the sons of the truly wealthy, the Tom Buchanans of his generation, and he felt himself more the outsider than ever before. And we might think that outsider perspective is almost essential for crafting a great writer. And despite his sense that his vocation was a literary one, he came to despise the English department, whom he characterized as having, quote, an uncanny knack of making literature distasteful to young men. Again, the Princeton I came to know was quite different from the one he described. He especially objected to the way they would pick poetry to pieces, dissecting it until nothing of power and passion remained. He failed on the gridiron. He had hopes of being a great split end. He injured his knee in the first few weeks of tryouts and was never able to play football again. He read widely but indiscriminately, and he was too influenced by the fashionable writers of his day. Like Hemingway, he needed guidance in what to read. And he would get that guidance primarily in the early 1920s. The first significant intellectual influence on him was a classmate at Princeton, Edmund Wilson, who would become one of the great sort of literary and cultural critics of the early 20th century. Fitzgerald would later describe him as my intellectual conscience. And Wilson was sort of an intellectual sparring partner and one of the few people who could really guide Fitzgerald's writings and his tastes. He passionately believed in the Princeton honor system, which is of some moment to this audience. And he said at one point, there were many times that a carefully tucked away note or a little bit of cheating would have made all the difference for me, and it never even occurred to me. He was committed to that ideal of honor. Important to keep in mind with Fitzgerald. He said in 1915, in the middle of his Princeton experiences, "If I couldn't be perfect, I wouldn't be anything." If I couldn't be perfect, I wouldn't be anything. So again, he commits himself to failure. Socially, Fitzgerald scored his greatest triumphs in the Triangle Club, the famous Princeton musical comedy society for which he wrote plays, songs, routines, parodies, whatever else was needed. In his sophomore year, he was elected secretary of the Triangle Club. And he certainly would have been president in his senior year. But his academic work was so abysmal that he became ineligible for extracurricular activities, and all he really cared about was extracurricular activities. I mean, that was what he was really committed to. And this failure devastated Fitzgerald. It was as if he had repeated his father's failed life. And he later described his feelings in his famous essay of 1936, The Crack-Up, which you have in your binder and which I'll refer to multiple times throughout the week. He said after this experience, quote, "To me, college would never be the same. There were to be no badges of pride, no medals after all. It seemed on one March afternoon that I had lost every single thing I wanted. Some old desire for personal dominance was gone. Life around me was a solemn dream. A man does not recover from such jolts. He becomes a different person. And eventually the new person finds new things to care about." It's the same way he described that experience of his father. He had lost his immaculateness of purpose. Now, while he underwent these social, athletic, and literary failings, he also failed in the realm of romance. In his sophomore year, he met Ginevra King, a 16-year-old beauty from Lake Forest, Illinois, who was lovely, rich, socially prominent, and sought after, the young Fitzgerald's romantic ideal. He courted Ginevra, became her most prominent suitor for a time, but after a tumultuous year, she rejected him, and to Fitzgerald, the reason was clear. Poor boys, as someone remarked in his hearing at the King's home, shouldn't think of marrying rich girls. This failure was scorched into Fitzgerald's very self. He never got over this. As he grew older, he thought of Princeton with more and more affection. Indeed, the day he died, he was making notes in the Princeton Alumni Weekly on the Tigers' 1941 football prospects. And he always had a sense that he had lost something there, some sense of himself and what he had hoped to be and now knew he could never be. The sense of the loss of the illusions of youth would become one of his most prominent themes. So he enters Princeton in the 1913-14 year. It's his freshman year. Then his sophomore year. In the fall of his junior year, he becomes ill. Maybe malaria, maybe nascent tuberculosis, which he battled for most of his life, and he had to drop out. He returned to Princeton to repeat his junior year, got a number of F grades in the fall, certainly would have been put on some kind of suspension, but then he entered the military, left Princeton, and never formally returned. So the myth that he failed out or dropped out is never really quite accurate. He just sort of petered out. Princeton never concluded for him, and so it lived on in his mind in many respects. Brucoli captures the sense he had of Princeton brilliantly. He said, "His poor scholastic record does not betray indifference to Princeton. He loved it and became almost a caricature of the loyal alumnus." I mean, really, you'd have to go to a place like Notre Dame or Washington and Lee to find more of an exemplar of the loyal alumnus. That's not what Brucoli said. That's what I said. Sorry. Back to Brucoli. For the rest of his life, he returned to Princeton as though looking for some irrecoverable part of himself. Now, the onset of World War I seemed a welcome diversion to Fitzgerald, and he entered the Army as a lieutenant, prepared to die gloriously in a European battlefield. He was not a promising commander. The troops under him made fun of him. They hid his horse. They sent him on phantom journeys. It was not a good experience. But in June of 1918, While stationed in his training camp in Montgomery, Alabama, he fell in love with the most prominent Alabama belle, Zelda Sayre, and everything changed for him forever. Like Ginevra King, Zelda was Fitzgerald's ideal. Wealthy, beautiful, the object of fierce competition. But she was also an extraordinary individual, hardly the type of the well-mannered young lady. There are many illustrative stories of this. One of my favorites is her chaperones once berated her for dancing too affectionately at a ball. And the 18-year-old responded by pinning mistletoe to her dress just a few inches above her backside. You know, kiss this, right? Self-confident, bold, dismissive of any rule that would limit her independence, artistic. She fascinated Fitzgerald, whose own social aspirations were actually much more cautious and conventional than were Zelda's. Within a few months, he had become her #1 suitor. They likely consummated their relationship that summer before he was to leave for France. But when the war ended, with Fitzgerald never leaving the U.S., his prospects were bleak. He had no wealth. He was forced to work in an advertising agency in New York. Crucial experience for the young writer. He became a student of the symbol. That's what advertising is all about. And there are many scholarly articles that talk about the influence of his advertising work on his writing. For example, one of the advertisements he wrote was about a new car called the Jordan, which becomes, in a complicated way, Jordan Baker. You might recall that in The Great Gatsby, he talks about Gatsby. Daisy says, "You look like the advertisement of the man." He was filled with a sophisticated understanding of what the world of advertising meant. So he takes this job in New York while working on his novel in progress titled The Romantic Egotist. Fitzgerald is the all-time worst at bad working titles. What the hell does that mean? The Romantic Egotist. This Side of Paradise, that's a fantastic title. The Drunkard's Holiday, working title for Tender is the Night. I don't want to read that book. Tender is the Night. Beautiful, evocative, comes from Keith. Great title. We'll talk about titles when we get to The Great Gatsby. In January of 1919, Monsignor Fay dies, loses that spiritual guide. In June of that year, Zelda firmly rejects his marriage proposal. Just like Rosalind in This Side of Paradise, she said she could not live a life of mediocre poverty, and she knew Fitzgerald would despise her if she lost her glitter. In July, Prohibition begins. In August, Scribner's rejects his novel, and Fitzgerald returned to St. Paul with one mission: to rewrite this novel so it would be a great success and thereby to win back Zelda's hand. So notice the way he responds to failure, with renewed vigor and challenge. He wouldn't be a great writer without that. And remarkably, he does it. Remarkably. I mean, either of those is really hard, to write a great novel or to win back a woman who has said no to your proposal of marriage. He does both. He spends the fall of 19 transforming The Romantic Egotist into This Side of Paradise. And the central story in the novel would be Amory Blaine's doomed courtship of Rosalind, the wealthy girl whom he would love and lose because he was too poor. Fitzgerald had taken his greatest failure, the loss of Zelda, and transformed it into his first great success. This Side of Paradise was accepted by Scribner's in the fall of 1919. On March 26th, it was published, of 1920, and on April 3rd, a week later, Scott and Zelda were married. Here are some images of them. Zelda on the top and on the side a little younger, and then a famous image of them in the early 1920s. Let me quote again from Brucoli about the marriage. He writes, "An understanding developed that Zelda would marry him when This Side of Paradise was published. but the engagement announcement did not appear in the Montgomery Journal until 28 March, 6 days before the wedding. Her reconsideration, it's very important, was not entirely a mercenary matter. She was not committing herself to a famous and wealthy author. Remember, he's nothing right now. He's got a book contract. That's it. The reception of his novel was uncertain, and neither of them had any idea what Fitzgerald's income would be. Zelda responded to his regained confidence, to his ability to fulfill his ambitions. As she later wrote, he made life promissory. That's an economic term. It's a financial term, but it's also the promise of great fulfillment. So she took a gamble as well. A little bit about this side of paradise. Fitzgerald was working with a young editor at Scribner's, whom I'm sure you've heard of, Maxwell Perkins. When Scribner's turned down the first version of This Side of Paradise, Perkins offered his resignation. He said, "My feeling is that a publisher's first allegiance is to talent. And if we aren't going to publish a talent like this, it is a very serious thing. If we're going to turn down the likes of Fitzgerald, I will lose all interest in publishing books." Scribner, the guy himself, said he would reconsider. Imagine if they hadn't. No Perkins, no Fitzgerald, no Thomas Wolfe, no Hemingway, no American literature as we know it. And let me share with you a letter that Zelda wrote about this time. This is when she accepts him. This is in February, 2 months before the wedding. "Darling heart, our fairy tale is almost ended, and we're going to marry and live happily ever afterward, just like the princess in her tower who worried you so much. I'm sorry for all the times I've been mean and hateful, for all the miserable minutes I've caused you when we could have been so happy. You deserve so much, so very much. I think our life together will be like these last 4 days, and I do want to marry you, even if you do think I dread it. I wish you hadn't said that. I'm not afraid of everything. To be afraid a person has either to be a coward or very great and big. I am neither. Besides, I know you can take much better care of me than I can. And I'll always be very, very happy with you. Except sometimes when we engage in our weekly debates. And even then I rather enjoy myself. I like being very calm and masterful while you become emotional and sulky. I don't care whether you think so or not, I do. Sweetheart, I miss you so, I love you so, and next time I'm going back with you, I'm absolutely nothing without you, just the doll that I should have been. You're a necessity and a luxury and a darling, precious lover, and you're going to be a husband to your wife." The poignancy of letters like that, given what's going to happen in the next decade and a half, is palpable. And she too embraced the hope, the immaculateness of purpose that she saw not just in Fitzgerald, but in their life together. That same month, February 26th of 1920, Fitzgerald wrote, "Zelda's the only God I have left now." The year before, he concluded his writer's notebook by saying, summing up the year by saying, "A year of enormous importance, work and Zelda, last year as a Catholic." So the sense of leaving behind the religion of his youth for the two new religions of writing and love. The novel was fabulously successful, more so than any of his subsequent works. An early success, the curse of an early success. The first printing of 3,000 copies sold in 3 days. By the end of 1921, it had sold nearly 50,000 copies. It was seen as new, daring, iconoclastic, capturing the style and the tenor and the cynicism of the new generation. And Fitzgerald became the icon for that generation. Stylish and good-looking, with his dashing bride by his side, he was described as an advertisement for the new man, just as he would describe Gatsby. Now, the book did not make him wealthy in any real sense, but it did provide him with money and with fame. But curiously, the novel itself suggests that everything to come would be a failure, a disappointment, an inadequate response to what had been lost in youth. Now, This Side of Paradise is a coming-of-age novel, what all great novelists write as generally their first book. It's about the growth of the hero, but also the growth of the artist. So it is a Bildungsroman, the novel of education or of growth, and it is a Künstlerroman, the novel about the maker or the artist, the portrait of the artist as a young man. In this respect, one of its great models is James Joyce's novel of that name, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, published in 1916, just a few years before. And Fitzgerald read that book as he was writing The Romantic Egotist, and you can see the traces of Joyce's novel everywhere in Fitzgerald's novel. Joyce's book is about his artist hero leaving the constraints of church and of nation, and shifting from the worship of God to the worship of art. Fitzgerald parallels that in many respects, but with the American difference of not rejecting the nation, but rather looking at it with both a loving and a critical eye. His hero, Amory Blaine, tracks much of Fitzgerald's own life. Amory as a child in St. Paul, his parents, his journey to Princeton, his love and courtship of Rosalind, his academic failures, and ultimately his confrontations with suffering, with death, the death of one of his great dashing friends, Dick Humbird, and of his father, who again he kills off in 1919, though Fitzgerald's father would live much longer than that. And one of the poignant things of reading the book as one ages. It's a great book to read as a college student, yes, but a great book to read with distance on college. One of the poignant things is seeing the ways in which the stresses of adult life begin to impinge upon young Amory. He begins to have hallucinations. He has a terrible night where he sees a vision of the devil. The weight, not just of adulthood, but of the world he's preparing to enter, the world that's going to be torn apart by the First World War, the world that was changing so rapidly. That begins to have a powerful effect upon him. I just want to read snippets of a couple little passages here. One is as Amory is about to leave Princeton, and he's out with one of his good friends in the evening. And Fitzgerald is always a writer of twilight, of the evening. And says, then the night came that was to be the last. He says to his friend Tom, the grass is full of ghosts tonight. And he responds, the whole campus is alive with them. You know, whispered Tom, what we feel now is the sense of all the gorgeous youth that has rioted through here in 200 years. For an instant, the voices of freshman year surged around them, and then they looked at each other with faint tears in their eyes. Damn. Damn. So these two young men with the whole world before them, as they prepare to leave the place of their youth, look each other in the eyes and each mutter, damn. That voice of regret and loss and wistfulness for what has passed. He then experiences the failure of his great love for Rosalind. In their final confrontation, she says, it's been so perfect, you and I, so like a dream that I'd longed for and never thought I'd find, the first real unselfishness I've ever felt in my life, and I can't see it fade out in a colorless atmosphere. Marrying you would be a failure, and I never fail, she says to Amory. I can't, Amory. I can't be shut away from the trees and flowers cooped up in a little flat waiting for you. You'd hate me in a narrow atmosphere. I'd make you hate me. I don't want to think about pots and kitchens and brooms. I want to worry whether my legs will get slick and brown when I swim in the summer. And it ends, and deep under the aching sadness that will pass in time, Rosalind feels that she has lost something, she knows not what, she knows not why. We begin to see that Rosalind is not what Amory thinks she is. She's a disappointing embodiment of his desires, not through any fault of her own, but through what he decides she must embody for him. And therein is the Gatsby-Daisy dynamic, as I'll talk about tomorrow. Let me just give you a few quotes about the novel from Fitzgerald's friend Edmund Wilson. Wilson wrote about This Side of Paradise, "It has almost every fault and deficiency that a novel can possibly have."
Good friend.
Good friend. It is really not about anything. The story itself is very immaturely imagined. It is always just verging on the ludicrous, but it does not commit the unpardonable sin. It does not fail to live. The whole preposterous farrago is animated with life. So what do you want to hear? It's a good story, it's well plotted, nice execution, or it lives. You know, there's this sense Wilson saw that there is genius in this novel. It's a really tough novel to teach because you almost have to say to students, hang in there, it's weird, it jumps all over the place, it shifts forms, there's no control of the voice, it clearly shows the seams of multiple parts being stitched together, but just wait. Wait for those luminous moments of great art. And then on your handout, I've given you three moments from the book. The first comes from the middle. Great quote about the Princeton experience, where Amory thinks, "The great tapestries of trees had darkened to ghosts back at the last edge of twilight. The early moon had drenched the arches with pale blue, and weaving over the night, in and out of the gossamer rifts of moon, swept a song with more than a hint of sadness, infinitely transient, infinitely regretful." That's a fiction writer who has read his Keats. That's a writer who understands the poetry of the fading of youth. And then Amory as a writer-to-be. If you've read your Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, you can hear it here. I'll just read the last part. "His own temperament of the balm of love and children preserved to help in building up the living consciousness of the race. In self-reproach and loneliness and disillusion, he came to the entrance of the labyrinth." That's the great metaphor of Joyce's portrait. The artist, like Daedalus, the great builder of the labyrinth, preparing to enter that maze and to find his way into the construction of art. And then the very famous ending of the novel. "Long after midnight, the towers and spires of Princeton were visible, with here and there a late burning light, and suddenly out of the clear darkness the sound of bells. As an endless dream it went on, the spirit of the past brooding over a new generation. The chosen youth from the muddled, unchastened world still fed romantically on the mistakes and half-forgotten dreams of dead statesmen and poets. Here was a new generation, shouting the old cries, learning the old creeds, through a reverie of long days and nights, destined finally to go out into that dirty gray turmoil to follow love and pride. A new generation dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success, grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken." It's amazing reading that, how contemporary that is. Much of that could be used to describe the college generations we're teaching right now. Amory, sorry for them, was still not sorry for himself. Art, politics, religion, whatever his medium should be, he knew he was safe now, free from all hysteria. He could accept what was acceptable, roam, grow, rebel, sleep deep through many nights. There was no God in his heart, he knew. His ideas were still in riot. There was ever the pain of memory, the regret for his lost youth. Yet the waters of disillusion had left a deposit on his soul. Responsibility and a love of life, the faint stirring of old ambitions and unrealized dreams. But oh, Rosalind, Rosalind, it's all a poor substitute at best, he said sadly. And he could not tell why the struggle was worthwhile, why he had determined to use to the utmost himself and his heritage from the personalities he had passed. He stretched out his arms to the crystalline, radiant sky. "I know myself," he cried, "but that is all." A poor substitute at best. That's the regret for the flower of life, to use the phrase from Newland Archer at the end of Wharton's The Age of Innocence, published in the same year, 1920. The arms stretched out to the crystalline sky. That's Gatsby at the end of the first chapter of that novel, reaching out towards the green light at the end of Daisy's Dock, that same longing for what has already passed. But now it was the 1920s. What Fitzgerald would later describe as, quote, the greatest, gaudiest spree in history. America was roaring to a new music, and Scott and Zelda were at the heart of it all. The bull market made people fabulously wealthy, or at least made people feel that wealth was all around them. In that next year, Scott sold a story to Hollywood for $2,500. He spent the money very quickly, but he had this feeling that the money would always be there, that this source was never going to be tapped out. And in that sense, he was a sort of tragic embodiment of America in the 1920s. Drink was forbidden, which meant that for the first time in American history, to have fun and to break the law became synonymous, as perhaps they have been ever since. Well, we could do a whole lecture on organized crime and prohibition. That is a major subcomponent of The Great Gatsby, as we'll see with Meyer Wolfsheim. Scott and Zelda partook of the revelry as furiously as anyone, perhaps more so, since they were seen as symbols of the age and they had a celebrity status to uphold. So they drove their celebrity status and they responded to it, that kind of vicious cycle of fame. But while Zelda drank for fun, we could say, Scott was already showing that inability to control his drinking and the erratic behavior while under the influence that marked the alcoholic. And again, they had a certain amount of money, but they didn't have nearly enough to sustain their exorbitant lifestyle. And thus began Fitzgerald's pattern of writing. He would furiously turn out short stories that he could sell to the popular magazines, especially the Saturday Evening Post, which became Fitzgerald's magazine, and he became their writer. By 1929, the Post was paying him $4,000 per story. How many fiction writers in 2016 would give anything to be paid $4,000 per story? And this is in the 1920s. He would turn out the stories to carve out a stretch of time in which he could just focus on his novels. And for him, the novel was always where he staked his greatness. He had a kind of scornful attitude toward his short stories. So he'd have this cycle of riotous living, furious work on the short fiction to pay for the riot, and a sense that the work was not what he really wanted to do. And gradually, a resentment of Zelda and their lifestyle for draining his creative energy and not supporting his main ambition for greatness, which was to write his great novels. Zelda, meanwhile, resented the power shift in their relationship, in which Scott was now the famous socialite and she became known as Fitzgerald's wife. As the 20s moved along, their relationship would become increasingly tense, exhausted, competitive, and soaked in the gin and champagne haze of what all thought would be an endless party. In 1922, he brings out The Beautiful and Damned, his second novel. Very odd book for Fitzgerald, a different kind of aesthetic. It's his longest novel by far. It is a very naturalistic, almost deterministic novel. It's somewhere in between the experimentalism of This Side of Paradise and the gorgeous lyricism of The Great Gatsby. I will read you, Brucoli has given a better short summary of it than I can give, and I don't want to give a lecture on the book. Nobody really likes it that much. I mean, maybe the real Fitzgeraldians just love it. But he wrote, let's see, I'm on the wrong page, 179. Here's a good description of the book, which gives you a sense of where Fitzgerald is in the early 20s. A novel of character deterioration. So we're thinking Tender is the Night as well. The Beautiful and Damned chronicles Anthony and Gloria Patch as they wait to inherit his grandfather's fortune. It opens in 1913 with Anthony, 4 years out of Harvard, idling gracefully on his income and fostering his self-image as an immaculate intellectual. kind of version of Richard Diver in some respects. He marries Gloria Gilbert, and they both undergo an inexorable decline fueled by alcohol and the spending of capital. Again, the economic metaphors are just fantastic for his life. Anthony's grandfather, a rabid reformer, invades one of their drunken parties and disinherits him. After the grandfather's death, the Patches initiate a long process of breaking the will. Anthony is drafted during the war and has an affair with a lower-class Southern girl. While the inheritance case is being decided after the war, Anthony becomes a sloppy drunk and Gloria's beauty coarsens. They get the money in 1921, but Anthony's mind and health are broken. Two things about this book. One, so much a precursor of what is to come in their own lives, as well as in Fitzgerald's artistic direction. And two, he had to write that book. He had to learn those styles of naturalism and determinism and realistic fiction in order to go the next level for the writing of The Great Gatsby. Wilson said about both Beautiful and Damned and This Side of Paradise that Fitzgerald has this great imagination but no artistic control. So he's sort of this romantic poet, but he doesn't really have the craftsmanship of the artist. Maybe that's true of the first two novels. The Great Gatsby is the finest example of artistic mastery that we can find in world literature. So Fitzgerald learns that artistic control without losing that poetic inspiration and lyricism. Let's see, what else happens? Scotty is born in 1922, their daughter, who becomes both the focus of his life and an afterthought, depending on the mood, the sobriety level, the economic pressures, Zelda's madness, etc. They go to Europe in 1924, mainly for economic reasons. The dollar would stretch so much further in Europe, and they could continue a kind of lavish lifestyle on the income that he could generate. They do experience the expatriate lifestyle in Europe, but they are not living the life of the lost generation on the left bank of Paris, like Hemingway in a garret, writing, warming his hands over a coal fire. They're doing just fine. They're on the right bank of Paris. They're moving in social circles, more so than artistic circles, etc. And I'll talk a bit more about that on Wednesday in my lecture on Fitzgerald and Hemingway, one of the great literary relationships in American history. The friendship for Hemingway is seminal for Fitzgerald and even more so for Hemingway, and it's during this time that he writes The Great Gatsby, and it is published. Let's see. All right, his writings in the 20s, I've touched on some of this already, The Beautiful and Damned. He does do a play called The Vegetable that Gershwin was very interested in. Tim Gaillard and I had a great exchange about this play and its possibilities. Produced in 1923, failed dismally. He's not bad at writing dialogue, but Fitzgerald is an internal writer, like Henry James, who also was just a failure at writing the drama. And this play failed and left him in great debt. More short story writing. 1923, he earned $29,000. Still wasn't enough to pay the bills. Returned to the story writing. Financed a summer of 1924 of uninterrupted work on the novel. And this would become The Great Gatsby. Now let me close by saying just a few words about the stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald. We must not make the mistake of thinking that the stories are just commercial affairs, that he just wrote them for the money. Some are that, some are fashionable, predictable, period pieces, I would describe them as, sort of representative of the concerns of the 20s and 30s. And certainly, particularly as the 20s move along, he will crank them out to make easy money. And if you work your way through the collected stories, he really is in need of a greatest hits. He needs somebody to edit those stories, as Brucoli has done in one of his many books on Fitzgerald, the selected stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Great volume if you want to read through the best ones. Many of them are very fine, and some of them stand as among the most brilliant short stories in the English language. I go back and forth between Fitzgerald and Hemingway about which was the better short story writer. And you don't have to choose. I mean, you can love them both. But it's interesting that both were great novelists and great short story writers. That craft of the story was very important to both writers. So let's see. Let me talk a bit about the stories then. There's a great quote by Brucoli. The cycle of debt kept Fitzgerald in bondage to the magazines. It seemed he could always write another story, and his story price kept going up. Writing stories provided Fitzgerald with no satisfaction and generated guilt because he knew that his chance for greatness depended on novels. So that's what he's wrestling with. He published about 160 short stories altogether. This was his money-making trade, as I've said. In 1929, his stories earned him $30,000. His novels earned him $30. So this is a tough choice that he has to make. Which are you going to work on at any given time? Again, this is how he supported their impossible lifestyle, and this is also how he could pay for Zelda's hospital care and the extraordinary expenses of the mental institutions that she would be in and out of from the late 20s through the rest of her life. Scribner's brought out 4 volumes of his short fiction, Flappers and Philosophers and Tales of the Jazz Age in the pre-Gatsby period. All the Sad Young Men the next year, and then Taps at Reveille in 1935. But these are only part of the complete stories. The stories, a representative story of the early ones is Bernice Bobs Her Hair of 1920. The bane of every high school English class. You read that story, I mean, wow. So she gets her hair cut. What's the big deal? It's right next to Twain's, The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. Great story, but I read that as a junior in high school. I thought, come on, this is just terrible. I didn't want to, now I love the story, and my job is to convince young readers why it's so magnificent. But among the great stories in the 1920s is a series that we refer to as the Gatsby cluster stories. A half dozen or so stories written in the early 20s, right when he was beginning work on that novel. So after Beautiful and Damned, but before Gatsby, that deal with some aspect of the Gatsby themes and motifs. The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, written in 1922, satirical view of wealth and how it corrupts. Dice, Brass Knuckles, and Guitar in 1923, the idea of the outsider, the one without who wants to penetrate the circles of the fabulously rich. Absolution in 1923, part of an early draft of Gatsby, which gives a portrait of what Jay Gatsby might have been like as a young boy. The Sensible Thing in 1924 shows the pain of losing the beloved girl because of a disparity in wealth. And most important of all, Winter Dreams in 1922, which one scholar has described as the Great Gatsby in miniature. It is not that. That's sort of like saying Beethoven's Fifth in miniature. What? You can't, condense it in that way. But fair enough. It's one of the best short stories of the century. And it shows us where Fitzgerald's imagination was as he grapples with sudden success and tries to reconcile his past of disappointment with his future of hopes and fears. It's the story of Dexter Green, poor young boy, Judy Jones, fabulously wealthy, desirable girl. He falls in love with her. She teases him. He abandons his fiancée for her. She rejects him. He's brokenhearted. He goes on, picks himself up, self-made man, becomes very wealthy. Then at the end of the story, 10 years after all this has happened, he's chatting with a friend who's recalling their days in St. Paul. And the friend talks about this friend they once had, Judy Jones, who's in a bad marriage, husband abuses her, treats her badly, and Dexter cannot believe what he is hearing, the way she is being described. He says, he says. Well, let me do one thing first. Just before he goes out with her for the first time, right in the middle of the story, he's about to go meet her at this ball, and he listens to some music. The sound of the tune precipitated in him a sort of ecstasy, and it was with that ecstasy he viewed what happened to him now. It was a mood of intense appreciation, a sense that for once he was magnificently attuned to life. That goes right into The Great Gatsby. And that everything about him was radiating a brightness and a glamour he might never know again. So right when he's about to have the transformative experience, he's thinking, the best is somehow behind me. I'm watching it go past me at this very moment. From that moment on, his decline is certain. So Fitzgerald introduces one of his great themes, what we might call the man who is broken by the desired woman. This would be the theme in The Beautiful and Damned, The Great Gatsby, Tender is the Night. At times he viewed his marriage to Zelda in that light. It's a theme he inherits from his favorite poet Keats and his great poem La Belle Dame sans Merci. And it could be an epigram to this whole story. But let me emphasize now, Fitzgerald's females are not man-eaters. They are not the classic femme fatales. Rather, his men suffer from a romantic weakness, and in some sense, they seek and will their own destruction. Like the figures of courtly love in the medieval romances that Fitzgerald adored, his male characters devote themselves to an ideal they would rather die for than betray. Now, the conclusion of the story. His friend is describing Judy Jones. He says, oh yeah, she's a nice girl who stays at home with the kids and was a pretty girl once, but still has nice eyes. And Dexter, it's just great. Dexter says, nice girl, pretty eyes. This is describing the Madonna. This can't possibly be adequate. He says, why? Judy Jones wasn't a pretty girl at all. She was a great beauty. I knew her. She was... And then he can't finish the sentence. And his friend says, I'm not trying to start a row. I'm not trying to argue. I'm just telling you she has nice eyes. A sort of dullness settled down upon Dexter. He had thought that having nothing else to lose, he was invulnerable at last, but he knew that he had just lost something more. He's already lost the girl. What's he losing now? As surely as if he had married Judy Jones and seen her fade away before his eyes. The dream was gone. Something had been taken from him. And now the gorgeous conclusion. He wanted to care, and he could not care. For he had gone away and he could never go back anymore. The gates were closed. The sun was gone down and there was no beauty but the gray beauty of steel that withstands all time. Even the grief he could have borne was left behind in the country of illusion, of youth, of the richness of life, where his winter dreams had flourished. Long ago, he said, long ago, there was something in me, but now that thing is gone. Now that thing is gone, that thing is gone. I cannot cry, I cannot care. That thing will come back no more. It's a gorgeous conclusion. It has its sentimentality. It has some sort of sophomoric repetitions, all of which vanish with the gorgeous lyricism of The Great Gatsby. It expresses Fitzgerald's aesthetic of loss, in which, in Wordsworth's phrase, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more, for there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Like Amory Blaine in This Side of Paradise, Dexter can only weep for the lost moment of ecstasy when he still believed in this deathless beauty. Now, not only is the beauty gone, but the time when he could believe in it is gone as well. It's as if it was always lost, but only now does Dexter realize this. And he describes this with a telling metaphor: the gates were closed. Dexter is now barred from returning to a time when human beauty was truly deathless. And this, as I will discuss tomorrow, is at the very heart of Fitzgerald's aesthetic of loss. Thank you. So we have 12 minutes before we have to march directly to the group photograph. So I've got time for any questions or comments or thoughts. Yes, sir.
Would you like to explore a little further Bernice bobbed her hair? Describe it a little bit better and tell us why the initial impression in reading that story is one thing and rereading is something else.
Yeah, great question. It's a story of fashion. It's a story of advertising, it's a story of symbols, and beyond that it's a story of the symbols in which one's very self become invested. And so Bernice has the long hair of her true character and then bobs it, cuts it to follow the form of fashion and also to try to get in with the social crowd. And it's also a very sensitive story about the pressures that are unique to the female in a society of advertising and symbols and enormous social stress. Fitzgerald is very sympathetic, empathetic to the plight of the woman in society, as we'll see with his portrayal of Daisy Buchanan. And as students start to really click with that, they start to see that it really is one of those stories that is absolutely speaking to them right now today, whether it's a student getting tattoos or wearing shredded jeans or piercing various parts of their bodies, or it's the same ruthless social pressure and dynamic. There are superb studies of eating disorders and anorexia and this story of Bernice bobs her hair. There's even hints of that kind of pressure going on. Zelda certainly suffered from very similar physical manifestations of social pressure. So it's kind of unpacking the story from its sort of blithe 1920s mode for students to really understand what's going on there. So that's where literary English teachers become sort of archaeologists, helping students dig back into the past to see how that past is still speaking to us, in our very moment.
But she gets even at the end.
She does, yeah, and in some ways that's the saddest part of the story, the vengeance at the end, and in other ways we delight in that vengeance, which of course, and this is a characteristic Fitzgerald mode, makes us realize our own complicity in some of humanity's worst desires. I may be suffering, but by God, I'm going to make somebody else suffer too. That's not a noble moment for us. Yes?
Could you explain the disparity between the economics of the novel versus magazines? I mean, he could only earn, $5,000 on, a novel, and yet he could make $40,000, which today would be like $600,000 on the magazines. What were the sales? I mean, the sales of the magazines must have been through the roof.
They were, and that's the big difference. And that we have an economist talking about Fitzgerald, I mean, it's just I don't know who arranged this program, but they're just brilliant, to bring that perspective in. So I'll let Art add, but that is the big thing. His books, I mean, they sold fine. Any writer would be delighted with, sales in the tens of thousands and so forth. It's a myth that they just didn't sell at all, though they sold much more poorly than they wanted. But, just like today, the serious artistic novelist does not sell a whole lot of copies of her books. The popular writer, the romantic novelist, the sentimental writer, they sell lots. It was the same in his day, but this was a time really before television, when the written word was coming to you through these beautiful commercial magazines, and the Post is just a gorgeous thing to look at. And I sort of lament the loss of that rich magazine culture. But yeah, it was the sales on a scale, as I understand it, that really made the difference in terms of the wealth.
Before that, Scribners and stuff, my mother used to collect, bound copies of all of those different magazines. And they had the best writers of the time writing for them.
Did you write the screen?
The Post is back, too.
Screenwriting.
Oh yes, and Bart's going to talk about Fitzgerald and film. Absolutely.
I think your analogy to television is the perfect one, because even fairly successful novelists today would die to have his novels converted to a TV miniseries, because the money rolls there.
Or a movie.
Well, but yeah.
And when Bart talks about the economics of Hollywood, we'll see a a great example of that. Yeah, Huntley.
I'm fairly stunned to hear you say that some of his women were not manly. And let's go right to Winter Dreams. Judy Jones is beyond his abilities because of the money. He becomes one of the most successful shoe store owners in the entire Midwest. He comes back, he becomes engaged to a nice girl.
Irene Scherer,
Judy
good
Jones.
German-American stock.
Judy Jones finds out about it, goes for a car ride with him. Oh, won't you come in the house? And boom, she basically proposes to him. He accepts it. She is the epitome of a man. Now you can say she's a flawed woman who had her own problems, but she destroys him.
Let me respond with the words of Yeats, writing about Maud Gunn and Helen of Troy. Why, what else could she do, being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn? I would have us look at why the Judy Joneses and the Daisy Buchanans and Nicole Warrens, why it is that the men are destroyed in that way. What it is that force them, compel them to be what they are. And I'll talk about this with Daisy as much as I can tomorrow, and the ways in which Fitzgerald brings into relief the pressures upon the female character. Pressures that he was seeing on Zelda, that he knew he was complicit in putting upon Zelda, even though he was, in many ways, her most sympathetic companion. Judy is the two-dimensional version, in many ways, of Daisy Buchanan, but by reading back into that character, we start to see the ways in which society had constructed her in this way. There were no other options for her. She was compelled to be the person that she is. And then we see what happens to her. That vision of her at the end, we don't quite know what Devlin means by saying the husband treats her badly. He certainly is having affairs. He certainly is emotionally abusive. It could well be that he's hitting her and is physically abusive. We learn that she's taking care of the kids in the home, that she's very unhappy. She becomes sort of plain. The fate left to the woman who marries is a grim fate indeed, and that's the only fate allowed the woman. The other option would be the woman as artist, and that's the one that Zelda tries to cling to in the late 1920s, and that finally provokes her into madness. So this is part of what's happening with the new woman in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And we read Kate Chopin's The Awakening, or Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, or Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth. Brilliant, artistic, intellectual women who only have the marriage market and the social class market to propel them. And if they try to rebel against that, they are crushed. And so they have to find strategies in which to survive.
Then there's Jordan Baker, who was...
Oh, Jordan's a very complicated figure in this regard. Yeah. Myrtle Wilson, very complex in this sense. So I'm very glad you push the question here. I think it's a great one to pursue.
Jones' father was one of the wealthiest men in the country. She did not have to go for the marriage out. And of course it's interesting as to how and why she became that. That's what the characters in Gatsby are about, and some of those other characters, clearly the female character in The Beautiful and Damned. But she was a nasty human.
I guess I'm less interested in judging and condemning her, and more interested in seeing what is it, and that's why I want to reject that term. I'm interested in what is it Fitzgerald is trying to illuminate about the plight of women and of men during this time. And so to see, there's a tendency to read Daisy in particular as the downfall of Jay Gatsby. And that's a terribly limited reading of what Fitzgerald offers. It's an easier reading with Judy because we just have 18 pages, and again, it's a study for what he's going to do on a grander scale with Gatsby. Yeah.
Would it help to bring Brett Ashley into the conversation?
Just another, it was same sort of figure in The Sun Also Rises, sure.
She seems a little more the one who is fated to be.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, the novels of this time are filled with this. Catty Compson in The Sound and the Fury, Judith Sutpen in Absalom, Faulkner's incredible female characters who are trying, in a different kind of breathless social system, the stratification of the Old South in the early 20th century, trying to find ways to break out of a story they do not control. And then it's when we get the female novelists, starting with Edith Wharton, Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, Toni Morrison, telling from the woman's point of view stories that are quite similar in that respect. And the themes of madness and the artist figure, the mad woman in the attic motif. I mean, there's powerful narratives here that Fitzgerald and Hemingway in particular. Hemingway, it's even harder to make this case because we think of him as misogynistic and the macho man. And as I argued 5 or 6 years ago in our Hemingway program, boy, he's got a more nuanced view of gender and sexuality and of women. So Brett Ashley is a great example of that. Catherine Barkley in A Farewell to Arms and many others.